Hey guys, this video is coming to you from the inside of my living room where the inspiration for today's video is. Now, this right here is a TV stand that we bought from Target maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I gotta be honest with you, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this thing. See, the problem though is that when you're a maker like me and you have the ability to kind of make new things, the problem is you're always looking for things that you think you could make better. And one of those things happens to be this particular TV stand. Now, like I said, it's pretty good and it served us pretty well, but there's two things in particular that I'd love to be able to change on the new one that I make. The first one being this sound bar, how we have to have the sound bar basically sitting on top because there's nowhere within the TV stand itself for it to live. And that's something that I'd love to be able to change with the new version, is give it a cubby where it can live and basically have the top free and clear. And the other little nitpicky thing that I don't love about this one is there's a little bit of a gap here where this doesn't go all the way to the floor. And all that does is just basically create a place where a lot of dust can live and it's something that I can see, and it just happens to bug me. So on the new one, I'm gonna make sure that I make the baseboard trim go all the way to the floor. And then as far as everything else, it's pretty much just leaving it the same. Just taking the dimensions of the electronics that we have and making cubbies for those. Now, because of the change in technology, some of the technology we have now is a little bit smaller. Most things are streaming these days, so there's really no need for a cable box or anything bulky like that. So, and that's gonna help give me the space for the sound bar as well. So then as far as the top for this thing goes, now I'm going to try to make an epoxy river tabletop to sit on the base of the TV stand. Now, this is something I've never done before. I've seen epoxy river tables all over the place the last couple of years. I've always thought they're really cool, but I've never been able to check it off my list. So
excuse the interruption, guys, but it was during this part of filming that Murphy decided that he just had to be in the video too. He's pretty much attached to my hip 24/7, but hey, I'm not complaining.
And I figured something this size would be a great place to start. So that's sort of my idea for the top. Now, this build is gonna be over a series of videos. So the first video in the series is gonna be the video you're watching, and that's gonna be all about building the base. Okay, so I guess it's time to get started on building the base of this TV stand. You ready? Let's go.
So as I mentioned before, the first video in this little TV stand build series is going to cover creating the base for the TV stand. I'm going to be making this base out of some 3/4 inch maple plywood. Now, I don't just decide I'm going to make something and just get to cutting down plywood all willy-nilly. Some people probably do that, and hey, more power to you. But my brain just isn't capable of keeping everything straight on its own, so I have to help it out a little by creating a plan of what sizes I need to cut everything to. Now, I've talked about this before in other videos on my channel, but I like to use a website called opticutter.com, which has a free cut list calculator. This just helps me keep all of my pieces organized, and it makes sure that I don't mess anything up. I mean, plywood is way too expensive these days to be making any mistakes. I'm sure most makers can relate to that. Now, there were a few last minute additions I decided to cut out, so that meant changing up the cut list on the fly. And you know what that meant? It meant I had to use my own noggin to calculate exactly how to cut all of this so there was zero waste. Honestly, the math wasn't that bad to do in my head on the fly, so someone tell me why I look so confused in this video. That brain looks like it's working overtime. Anyways, I spent some time cutting up my plywood with my circular saw first. I like to cut it a little bit bigger than I need to start, and then I trim everything to its final size on the table saw. It's literally impossible for me to not go all Kung Fu Panda on those leftover small strips of wood. So satisfying. Once I had my pieces ripped to their final width, I took them over to my miter saw and squared up the edges and then got them to their final length.
All right, I got all my pieces pretty much cut now for the base of my TV stand. And now the next thing I want to do is I've got a ton of just cuts here of pieces that I've cut up. And now I like to go ahead and label each of those pieces so I can sort of keep it all straight when it comes time for assembly. Now, typically I'll just throw a piece of painter's tape on here and write exactly what it is, but I couldn't find any painter's tape right now, so I probably have some somewhere around here, but for now I'm just going to use this carpenter's pencil to write on here what each piece is, and then when it comes time to sanding I can just sand that off. Once I have all my pieces labeled, the next step is to go ahead and get pocket holes in some of those pieces that are going to need pocket holes. Now to join everything together, I'm pretty much going to be using pocket holes with some support pieces, and the shelves will have pocket holes that'll kind of tie everything together. For like cabinet style stuff, pocket holes are just perfect for that type of assembly, so that's what I'm going to be going with here. So the next step is to go ahead and get all these pieces labeled and then work on getting pocket holes drilled in all the pieces that need pocket holes. Let's get going. All right, I got one more step that I need to take care of before it comes time to getting these pieces primed and painted and ready for assembly. And now what I need to do is I need to figure out what sort of back I'm going to put on this TV stand. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can attach a back. You can simply just glue one on. You could leave it open. I don't really want to leave it open and expose all of those cables and wires, and trust me, there are a lot. So I want to make sure that I can sort of have a back with a hole that a lot of those wires can feed through. That way it's a little bit cleaner of a look. Now, like I said, there are different ways that you can attach back. You can just glue it on and throw some nails in there, and for when I got started, that's what I would do. It's the simplest way to attach a back. But now that I've gotten a teeny bit more advanced in my woodworking, the way that I like to attach a back to a cabinet is to basically route out a 1/4 inch groove somewhere along my pieces that I can then slide a 1/4 inch piece of plywood into, and that can just sort of sit in there. I don't really apply glue or anything. I sort of just let it float in that routed out groove, and that will serve as the back for most of my cabinets. Now, typically what I like to do when it comes to routing out that groove is I use my router table with a 1/4 inch straight bit, and I just run all of my pieces through, giving me that groove that I need, and it's easy peasy. But I actually, the 1/4 inch bit that I have for my router table right now is a little bit too dull, so I don't want to run I don't want to run these pieces through my router table right now until I order a new bit. So I'm going to show you another way that you can route out that groove. It's really just as simple, and it just involves your table saw. So if you don't have a router table or a router and you want to route out that groove, you can easily do it on the table saw as well. So what I'm going to do to route out that groove is I'm going to figure out exactly where I want the groove to lie on each of my pieces. It's important to make sure when you look at your pieces to make note of things like orientation, which side is your best side, which side's going to be facing out, which side does the groove need to be on. That way you make sure that you're routing it out where that groove where you want it. So for what I did on this piece, I know that, see, I've already messed up here, haven't I? No, see, so this is the side that I want to route my groove out, and so I just made some marks, how far in I want that groove. Now, what I did is because I like to put, this is a support piece on the back here, that's going to be about 3/4 inches wide. I like to have a piece that runs vertical like that for support. So I like to make sure that I leave my groove at least a little bit more than 3/4 inches in. That way it allows me to have room to basically screw that support piece into the back. So what I did is I made a mark that was about 7/8 inch from my edge here, and I made a mark, and then I used that mark to sort of set the fence on my table saw so that my blade is going to be just inside of that mark here. I'll zoom the camera in a little bit closer here in just a second so you can see. But basically, I have my blade just inside that mark that I made. I'll have to lower the height of my blade because obviously I don't want to cut all the way through my piece. I just want to cut in there enough to take out some of that material. And then once I run it through once, I'll shift my fence over and run it through again. And your blade, at least my blade width, is about 1/8 of an inch. So if you run it through twice, you're gonna get roughly that 1/4 inch groove that you're looking for. And if you don't, you kind of can just keep maneuvering it, keep playing with it until you get that 1/4 inch groove that you want. And then just take a scrap piece to test it out, and then you'll have the groove that you're looking for. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and make sure everything's set up like I want it. I'm gonna take this table saw outside because I don't like dust in the shop and I don't have dust collections. So we're gonna bring this outside, make sure everything's set up, and then I'm gonna show you guys how I run all these pieces through to get the groove that I need. All right, let's go. All right, so this is what I got. As you can see, there's a little bit of leftover material here. I'll just take a little chisel, or you can use a screwdriver or something and get in there, get that out. All right, she's looking pretty clean. Okay, and now I've just got a test piece of 1/4 inch stock here. Just gonna test it out to see if I need to take off a little bit more. I could probably force it to go in there, but I think it's a little bit too tight and I don't want it quite that tight. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take it out there, run it through one more time and just take a little bit more off that. That way I can get a nice flush fit in there. All right, let's see what we got. All right, that fits in there pretty good. I think I did take off a little bit more than I needed to, so I'll just make note of that. And so for all the other pieces that I run through, I'll try to take just a tad bit less off, but this is gonna work out good. So now all I need to do is go ahead and route out the rest of my grooves for all my pieces. All right guys, so let me fill you in on something that's pretty funny but also slightly embarrassing. This plywood that I'm using is actually sanded maple plywood, and guess who did not figure that out until just a few weeks ago that it was sanded? Yep, that was me. So I've been sanding this plywood on pretty much every project that I've been using it for in the past, and I guess I totally didn't realize that it's supposedly pre-sanded from the factory, so you're supposed to technically be able to skip that step. And now I did do a project recently where I did skip the step of sanding and just applied primer and paint, and it turned out completely fine. So I think skipping the sanding was not an issue with this type of plywood. Now I don't know if you were trying to put stain or finish on it, if maybe that would make it a little bit different situation and you would want to sand it. I don't know, but just given my experience, the pre-sanded plywood seemed to work just fine when it came to paint. So for this base, I am going to be painting it, so I'll be able to skip the step of sanding, which I'm so happy about because that's one of the necessary parts of woodworking, but it's definitely not my favorite, so happy to be able to skip that step. I will knock down some of these rough areas that the table saw caused, and that's pretty much the extent of the sanding that I'm going to be doing. Now, for getting these pieces primed and painted, I like to personally go ahead and put primer and paint on all the interior sides of the base of my cabinet, because basically once it's assembled together, it's a lot harder to get in there and paint and prime and just like get your brush in there at all those awkward angles. And if you're working in a small space, then it just becomes more difficult. I even feel like even spraying it, it's still, I mean, I have a bulky paint sprayer, so still getting it in there to get in all the nooks and crannies crannies is a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and prime and paint all of my interior side faces before assembly, and that way I can go ahead and get that all taken care of. And then once it's assembled, I will apply more coats of paint. So that is my next step, to go ahead and get everything primed and painted. Let's get to it.
I ended up using some Valspar's signature paint in a color by Sherwin-Williams called Tricorn Black. Now, this is a really nice black color that I've used on a couple projects in the past. So if you're curious of what shade of black to go with, because come on, there are so many options, I can confirm that this is a really good one.
All right guys, I got a couple coats of paint on all these pieces now, and they're pretty much ready to be assembled. Now, how I'm gonna assemble it together is with a combination of some wood glue and pocket hole screws. Now, since I'm going with 3/4 inch material here, I'm gonna be using 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws to join everything together. And the combination between these two should be plenty strong to hold this TV stand base together.
To start assembly, I took the bottom shelf and applied some glue to each of the sides, and I worked on getting my side pieces attached to that. I made sure to set the bottom shelf up off the base about 2 inches because I do plan on adding a piece of baseboard trim. Now, since this was a pretty wide piece, I just used 2 clamps clamped together to try and hold it as tight as I could. I also used my right angle clamping squares throughout the whole assembly to make sure that I was keeping everything square. Alright, so when it comes to putting these divider pieces in, I want to make sure that I have the exact width that I want on each side, and I need it to be equal. Now, you could measure that out with a tape measure and try to get it perfect, but in my experience, it's harder to get it perfect that way. So what I like to do is I like to take some scrap wood and cut it to the exact width that I need. I typically will cut 2 pieces just to make sure that I have one for the front and the back of my piece, and then I put them in here, and then I use that as my guide to butt this up against, and that ensures that I make sure that I have the exact width that I want, and I can make sure that I keep it equal on both sides. Then it was time to cut down some panels that are going to be the back of my cabinet. I just rough cut them with my circular saw and trimmed them to their final size on the table saw. Once I had them cut, I put each of them in place to make sure they were a good fit. And if you remember from one of my earlier ramble sessions in this video, I mentioned that I wanted to have a hole in each of these back panels for all of the wires to feed through. So I marked the center of each of my panels, and then I took them over to my drill press where I cut out these holes using a 2-inch Forstner bit. With the bottom panels in place, I could work on getting the rest of the base assembled. Next up was attaching the middle shelf, followed by all of the divider pieces. Another little tip for you, if you're trying to drill screws in some tight spaces, pick you up one of these right angle drill attachments. This makes a big difference in your frustration levels when it comes to working in small spaces. One of the last things I had to attach for the base were the top and back supports. I just screwed these into my base using some pocket hole screws. Lastly, I attached the remaining back panels.
Alright guys, take a look at this thing. I mean, it's starting to look like a TV stand, don't you think? Alright, so as you can see right now, I've got the carcass of my TV stand base together now. It still looks pretty rough. I've got a lot of these exposed plywood edges, but don't you worry, we're going to take care of that in the next step. But before I do that, I got to looking at this thing and I decided that I think I want to add a few more supports here in the middle. Because this is such a wide piece, I don't feel quite comfortable just leaving most of the weight on these two side legs here. So I think maybe to prevent any sort of sagging in the middle, I want to go ahead and cut some support pieces that I can attach into the middle here just to give it a little extra support, you know, a few extra legs to stand on. So anyways, that's my next step. I'm going to go ahead and cut the supports to add here, and then once I do that, then it'll be time to get some trim on this thing and start making it look really nice. Alright, I feel much better about this now. I think having these two extra supports here is really going to help prevent any sort of sagging, especially once I add all of the electronics to this thing. I think having these two extra legs here is really going to help out with that. Okay, so now it's time to move on to making this thing look a little bit fancier, and how I'm going to do that is basically by creating a face frame all around this to basically cover up these exposed plywood edges. Now, some people might like to just leave these edges as is and paint them. I'm just not one of those people. I like to cover up all of these edges and give it much more of a finished look. So how I'm gonna do that on this piece is I'm gonna use some of these popular boards here. I've used different boards in the past. When I first got started, pine was something that I used because it was the cheapest and the easiest to get, so that's what I would go with. After making several pieces using pine as a face frame, I kind of discovered that there's a lot more imperfections in that wood, and plus it's a lot softer, so you're gonna be able to dent that much easier, especially even just like with a fingernail, you could put an indentation in pine. Poplar is a much harder wood, and so it stands up a little bit better, I think, when it comes to being a face frame material, and it paints really well. So since this is going to be painted, this is a perfect thing to use in this situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to take my measurements for all of these sections that I want my face frame on, and then I'm going to cut this poplar down to size and join it all together, and then that'll give me a nice looking face frame that we can have on the front of our TV stand here. All that's left to do is just to do it. Let's get started.
Oh yeah, and one more thing that I learned when it comes time to making face frames is don't try to fight gravity, because gravity is always going to win in the long run. What I like to do is I like to lay my piece down flat, take all my measurements, and when it comes time to adding the face frame, I'm just laying the pieces on rather than trying to hold them up, clamp them in place. It's much harder that way, so I think laying it flat makes a big difference. We're not going to talk about how long it took me to come to that realization, but there's a little tip for you. Hope it helps. The only problem is if you're a shorty like me, you gotta use a step stool. To construct my face frame, I took some 1x2 boards and squared up the edges first, and then I cut them to the measurements that I took for my cabinet. I started with the side pieces first, and then I worked my way from there. Now, sometimes I will make up the whole face frame as one unit and then attach it as one piece to the cabinet, but I decided to just do it piece by piece for this project. To attach the face frame pieces to the cabinet, I used some wood glue and 1 1/4 inch brad nails.
You guys remember just a few minutes ago in this video where I basically sat there and trashed using pine and talked about how I hope that I don't have to use it again for face frames in the future. Well, as it turns out, a couple of these boards that I had sitting up on the shelf were actually pine boards instead of them all being poplar. I think because these are actually the select pine boards and they're in pretty good shape. I gotta say they have very few imperfections on them. They're pretty straight, and I think that's why I probably mistook them as all poplar boards when I saw them from afar on the shelf. So rather than go out and buy a bunch more poplar boards, which would just slow down my progress for today, I'm gonna go ahead and use these pine boards intermixed with some of the poplar boards, and I think that's gonna be totally fine. Since these are gonna be painted, I definitely don't think you'll even notice once the paint's on there, and the paint I'm using is pretty durable, which should help prevent any sort of nicks or dents in the wood. But we'll see. Like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and use this, what I have. Just wanted to hold myself accountable and let you guys know that even though I'd like to be able to use poplar for all of my face frames rather than pine, sometimes you just gotta go with what you got. So that's what I'm gonna do. And just like that, we now have a face frame on our TV stand. Okay, so now I just need to get all of these brad nail holes filled if I have any gaps, fill all that stuff with wood filler, get this sand because unfortunately this wood is not pre-sanded, so I will have to do some sanding on this face frame. Down here, I know it looks kind of funky, but I actually have a piece of baseboard trim that I'm gonna put on the bottom here and cover this up. Now I'm not going to add that baseboard trim until I have it up in place where I want it to go, because no floor in this shop is particularly level, so I'm gonna wait until I have it upstairs where I want it, and I've got it perfectly level and how it's probably gonna live, and then I'll put that baseboard trim on. So just ignore this for right now. So another little thing that I wanted to add to the TV stand base is I've got these holes cut out here to run wires through, and you know, the plywood is just pretty rough on its own, especially to be running wires along. So I found some of these 2-inch rubber grommets from Amazon, and I ordered a couple, and basically all you do is work it into the hole. I hope you're enjoying watching me struggle. Ah! Okay, let's start over. It was clearly that one. That one, yeah, must have been messed up. It couldn't be me. The funny thing is that I've already done this once on the other side and it went much smoother. Go figure, when I tried to film it, it didn't. But we're gonna get it. Okay, there we go. It's official. The putty knife is the magic trick. All right, it's in there good. I've got the ring around both sides. And then I just take a little knife here, utility knife, and then cut this rubber across. All right, and that's gonna give me a space that I can run all my wires through. That's gonna be a little bit softer. I could also, if I wanted to, I could cut this rubber all the way out. I'll leave it for now and make that call when it comes time to actually running the wires through. So anyways, just wanted to share that super useful little thing. If you are gonna be building a TV stand, these little rubber grommets are really good for the holes that the wires need to feed through.
All right guys, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, wow Sarah, this side looks awfully boring. And you know what? I'm gonna choose to not be offended by that because it does look pretty boring like it is. So I'm gonna spice this up a bit by adding some trim on each side of the TV stand. Basically, I'm gonna take some poplar and make sort of a rectangle on the sides, and then I'm gonna take it one step further and add another piece of trim inside of that rectangle, which will give it an even more finished look. All right, nothing to it but to do it. Alright guys, so this is sort of the design that I'm going to be going with for these side panel pieces. And yes, I know they're not 100% symmetrical. I didn't want to have to add another piece of trim to this side to get it 100% perfectly symmetrical. So all you OCD symmetrical people out there, just look away. But this is the design I'm going with. I still have to attach these inner trim pieces here with some glue and brad nails, but I think I'm gonna do that at another time because I was making some of these last cuts in the dark, and I think that's a sign that it's time to wrap it up for today. So when I come back to this, the next thing I'll need to do is just basically do the same trim on the other side, and then I'll also add some caulking all along here. I have to sand everything on the front and the sides, and then this thing will be pretty much ready for paint, and then we'll be able to move on to the next step of this build, which is figuring out the top. The next day, my buddy and I got back to work installing the rest of the trim for this TV stand. Once I had all the trim in place, I went ahead and filled all of the brad nail holes with wood filler and let it dry. Once the wood filler had dried, I sanded the cabinet up to 150 grit. I also added some caulking around my trim to make sure it paints up really well. Then prior to painting, I vacuumed the cabinet really well and wiped it down with a tack cloth. Then the last step was to get this thing painted. I sprayed on about 3 coats of that tricorn black, and the base for this TV stand was pretty much complete.
Alright guys, that is a wrap on part 1 of this series. As you can see, we have the base for our TV stand pretty much together now. There's still a few extra steps we got to do for this thing, and we'll get to that in the next few videos. Now, the next part of this build is getting the top put together. Now, you're not going to want to miss that. Like I said before earlier in the video, My plan is to make an epoxy river tabletop to sit on top of here. My first time doing it, so you guys want to follow along for that journey. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on my next video. And with that said, I'll see you guys again real soon. Bye.